It was as if a great weight slowly fell away from me. I reveled in the feel of the ground through my shoes, the taste of the air, the quiet hush of wind brushing through the spring wheat in the fields. I found myself grinning for no good reason, save that I was happy. We Roo are not meant to stay in one place for so long. I took a deep breath and nearly laughed out loud. I kept to myself as we traveled, not being used to the company of others. Rowant and the mercenaries were willing to leave me alone. Derek joked with me off and on, but generally found me too reserved for his tastes. That left the other passenger, Denna. We didn't speak until the first day's ride was nearly done. I was riding with one of the mercenaries, absently peeling the bark from a willow switch. While my fingers worked, I studied the side of her face, admiring the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck into her shoulder. I wondered why she was traveling alone, and where she was going. In the middle of my musing, she turned to look in my direction and caught me staring at her. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, brushing an errant strand of hair. "I was wondering what you're doing here," I said half honestly. Smiling, she held my eyes. Liar. I used an old stage trick to keep myself from blushing, gave my best unconcerned shrug, and looked down at the willow wand I was peeling.
Oh, look at you.
After a few minutes, I heard her return to conversation with Rita. I found myself strangely disappointed.
We scarfish.
After camp was set and dinner was cooking, I idled around the wagons, examining knots Rowant used to lash his cargo into place.
Doberman.
I heard a footfall behind me and turned to see Denna approaching. My stomach rolled over and I took a short breath to compose myself. She stopped about a dozen feet from me. "Have you figured it out yet?" she asked. "Excuse me?" "Why I'm here," she smiled gently. "I've been wondering the same thing for most of my life, you see. I thought if you had any ideas." She gave me a wry, hopeful look. I shook my head, too uncertain of the situation to find humor in it. "All I've been able to guess is that you're going somewhere." She nodded seriously. "That's as much as I've guessed, too." She paused to look at the circle the horizon made around us. The wind caught her hair and she brushed it back again. "Do you happen to know where I'm going?" I felt a smile begin a slow creep onto my face. It felt odd. I was out of practice smiling. "Don't you know?" "I have suspicions."
Smiling.
"Right now I'm thinking aniline." She rocked onto the edges of her feet, then back to the flats. "But I've been wrong before." A silence settled over our conversation. Denna looked down at her hands, fidgeting with a ring on her finger, twisting it. I caught a glimpse of silver and a pale blue stone. Suddenly, she dropped her hands to her sides and looked up at me. "Where are you going?" "The university." She arched an eyebrow, looking 10 years older. So certain. She smiled and was suddenly young again. "How does it feel to know where you are going?" I couldn't think of a reply, but was saved from the need for one by Rita calling us for supper. Denna and I walked toward the campfire, together. The beginning of the next day was spent in a brief, awkward courtship. Eager, but not wanting to seem eager, I made a slow dance around Denna before finally finding some excuse to spend time with her. Denna, on the other hand, seemed perfectly at ease. We spent the rest of the day as if we were old friends. We joked and told stories. I pointed out the different types of clouds and what they told of the weather to come. She showed me the shapes they held: a rose, a harp, a waterfall. So passed the day. Later, when lots were being drawn to see who had which turn at watch, Denna and I drew the first 2 shifts. Without discussing it, we shared the 4 hours of watch together, talking softly so as to not wake the others. We sat close by the fire and spent the time watching very little but each other. The third day was much the same. We passed the time pleasantly, not in long conversation, but more often watching the scenery, saying whatever happened to come to our minds. That night, We stopped at a wayside inn where Rita bought fodder for the horses and a few other supplies. Rita retired early with her husband, telling each of us that she'd arranged for our dinners and beds with the innkeeper. The former was quite good, bacon and potato soup with fresh bread and butter. The latter was in the stables, but it was still a long sight better than what I was used to in Tarbian. The common room smelled of smoke and sweat and spilled beer. I was glad when Denna asked if I wanted to take a walk. Outside was the warm quiet of a windless spring night. We talked as we wended our slow way through the wild bit of forest behind the inn. After a while, we came to a wide clearing circling a pond. On the edge of the water were a pair of waystones, their surfaces silver against the black of the sky, the black of the water. One stood upright, a finger pointing to the sky. The other lay flat, extending into the water like a short stone pier. No breath of wind disturbed the surface of the water, so as we climbed out onto the fallen stone, the stars reflected themselves in double fashion, as above,
Oh my
so below.
goodness!
It was as if we were sitting amid a sea of stars. We spoke for hours, late into the night. Neither of us mentioned our pasts. I sensed that there were things she would rather not talk about, and by the way she avoided questioning me, I think she guessed the same. We spoke of ourselves instead, of fond imaginings and impossible things.
Oh,
I pointed to the skies and told her the names of stars and constellations. She told me stories about them I had never heard before.
There's my balls,
My eyes were
dude.
always returning to Denna. She sat beside me, arms hugging her knees. Her skin was more luminous than the moon, her eyes wider than the sky, deeper than the water, darker than
This
the
guy's
night.
got the same problem I do. He's
It
got
slowly
chivalry,
began to
yeah.
dawn on me that I'd been
Chivalry on
staring
his
at her
mind.
wordlessly for an impossible amount of time, lost in my thoughts, lost in the sight of her. But her face didn't look offended or amused. It almost looked as if she were studying the lines of my face, almost as if she were waiting. I wanted to take her hand. I wanted to brush her cheek with my fingertips. I wanted to tell her that she was the first beautiful thing I had seen in 3 years, that the sight of her yawning to the back of her hand was enough to drive the breath from me,
Attack my sword.
how I sometimes lost the sense of her words in the sweet fluting of her voice. I wanted to say that if she were with me then, somehow nothing could ever be wrong for me again. In that breathless second,
Gonna kill you
I
with
almost
my
asked her.
arm.
I felt the question boiling up from my chest. I remember drawing a breath, then hesitating. What could I say?
Okay.
Come away with me?
I mean, that
Stay
makes
with
sense
me?
to me.
Come to the university? No. Sudden certainty tightened in my chest like a cold fist. What could I ask her? What could I offer?
These are
Nothing.
swords.
Anything I said would sound foolish. A child's fantasy. I closed my mouth and looked across the water. Inches away, Denna did the same. I could feel the heat of her. She smelled like road dust and honey, and the smell the air holds seconds before a heavy summer rain. Neither of us spoke. I closed my eyes. The closeness of her was the sweetest, sharpest thing my life had ever
Here's
known.
my front side. Watch out. That's my back around.
Chapter
My
34.
back side.
Yet to learn. The next morning, I blearily awoke after 2 hours of sleep, bundled myself onto one of the wagons, and proceeded to drowse away the morning. It was nearly noon before I realized that we had taken on another passenger at the inn last night.
Do you understand what
His
I'm saying?
name was Jazin, and he had paid Rowant for passage to Annalyn. He had an easy manner and an honest smile. He seemed an earnest man. I did not like him. My reason was simple. He spent the entire day riding next to Denna. He flattered her outrageously and joked with her about becoming one of his wives. She seemed unaffected by the late hours we had kept the night before, looking as bright and fresh as ever. The result was that I spent the day being irritated and jealous while acting unconcerned. Since I was too proud to join their conversation,
You could have sat
I was
back
left to
and-
myself. I spent the day thinking sullen thoughts, trying to ignore the sound of his voice and occasionally remembering the way Denna had looked last night with the moon reflecting off the water behind her.
This is straight.
That night, I was planning to ask Denna to go for a walk after everyone turned in for the night. But before I could approach her, Jason went to one of the wagons and brought back a large black case with brass buckles along the side. The sight of it made my heart turn sideways in my chest. Sensing the group's anticipation, though not mine in particular,
I'm dead.
Jason slowly undid the brass clasps and drew out his
You're
lute
hurt.
with an
Okay.
air of studied nonchalance.
That's fine.
It was a trooper's
cut to
lute.
head, guard your
Its
own.
long, graceful neck and round bowl were painfully
Cut to
familiar.
left side of face.
Sure of everyone's attention,
Guard
he
your
cocked
own.
his head and strummed, pausing to listen to the sound.
Cut to right side of
Then,
face.
nodding to himself,
Guard your own.
he started to play.
Fine.
He had a fair tenor and reasonably clever fingers.
Cut to
He
three.
played a ballad, then a light,
Double
quick
hit.
drinking song, then a slow,
Triple
sad
hit.
melody in a language that I didn't recognize, but suspected might be Yiddish.
Yeah. All right.
Lastly, he played Tinker
I'll
Tanner,
go right
and
here.
everyone came in on the chorus. Everyone but me.
I can't do it with the
I sat still as stone with my fingers aching. I wanted to
first
play,
attack?
not listen.
Cut to your head.
Oh.
Want isn't strong enough a word. I was hungry for
Right
it,
side of left side.
starved.
Of face. Guard my own.
I'm not proud of the fact that I thought about stealing his lute and leaving in the
I'm gonna
dark of the
take
night.
you right here.
He
That's why
finished
I
the
have
song
this.
with a flourish, and Rowan
This
clapped his
is the
hands a
line.
couple of times to get everyone's attention.
So, let's start that
Time
again.
for sleep! You sleep too late? Derek broke in, gently teasing. We get left behind. We know, Master Rowan. We'll be ready to roll with the light.
Okay. Okay.
Jason laughed and
That's
flipped
good.
open
That's
his
good.
lute
I
case
like
with
it.
his foot.
I like it. I
But
like it a
before
lot.
he could put it away, I called over to
Okay.
him. Could I see that for a second?
Start from.
I tried to keep the desperation out of my voice, tried to make it sound like idle curiosity.
Okay. And then your next one.
I hated myself for the
'Cause that
question.
blocks us.
Asking to hold a musician's instrument is roughly similar to asking to kiss a man's wife.
You attack.
Non-musicians don't understand.
I cut.
An instrument is like a companion and a lover. Strangers ask to touch and hold with annoying regularity.
I need to not do
Guard
this.
my own.
I knew better,
I need to do this.
but I couldn't help myself.
The guards for this
Just for a second,
thing are literally this.
I saw him stiffen
So it's
slightly,
cut to head.
reluctant.
So it's St. George.
but keeping friendly
Cut the left
appearances
side,
is a minstrel's
so it's
business,
inside,
just
go
as much
inside
as
normal
music.
guard.
Way
Certainly,
closer.
Either
he
way.
said with a
Wait,
jocularity
wait.
that I saw as false, but was probably
The next one
convincing
is
for the
that,
others.
and then it's
He
That's
strode over
inside
to me and
hanger,
held it out.
outside hanger,
Be careful.
and,
Jason took a couple of steps back and gave a very good appearance of being at ease,
cut the leg.
but I saw how he stood with his arms slightly bent, ready to rush forward and whisk the lute away from me if the need arose. I turned it over in my hands. Objectively, it was nothing special. My
Alright.
father would have rated it as one
Here,
short
you can
step
hand me
above
the
firewood.
axe, and I'll use the axe
I
upside
touched the wood. I cradled it against my chest.
down. And this is,
I spoke without looking up.
I can use
It's
the axe
beautiful,
like this, and this will
I said
represent the
softly,
curve.
my
What
voice
is the
rough
curve?
with emotion. It was beautiful. It was the most beautiful thing I had seen in 3 years.
I have a whole
More beautiful
lot
than the sight of a
greater curve
spring
than you.
field after 3 years of living in that pestilent cesspit of a city. More beautiful than Denna,
Yeah.
almost.
So,
I can honestly say that I was still not really myself. I was only 4 days
Well,
away from living on the
That's
streets.
why I want to go like
I was
this.
not the same person I had been back in the days of the troop, but neither was I yet the
Well,
person you
because
hear
just
about
think
in
of it as
stories.
I want to use the
I had
same
changed because of
curve
Tarbian.
that you
I had
have.
learned many things it would have been
Alright,
easier
so
to live
here I
without.
am.
so cut to
But
head.
sitting beside the fire, bending over the lute, I felt the hard, unpleasant parts of myself that I had gained in Tarbian crack. Like a clay mold around a now cool piece of iron, they fell away, leaving something clean and hard behind.
No, I just got you.
I sounded the strings,
I'm not.
one at a
I
time.
understand.
When I hit the third, it was ever so slightly off, and I gave one of the tuning pegs a
It's
minute
not- this one
adjustment
isn't
without
the
thinking.
hanger. It's
Here
I
now,
can do it like this.
don't go touching those.
cut to leg.
Jason tried
That
to
was
sound
the hanger.
casual. You'll turn it
And
from
then
true.
Inside hanger for the other one.
but I didn't really hear him.
And then
The singer and
cut your
all the
wrist.
rest couldn't have been farther away from me if they had been at the
I've
bottom of
guard
the
wrist.
Sentha Sea.
But I mean, we're slipping and sliding the whole time. So I'm
I
I touched the last string and tuned it to ever so slightly.
Here.
Yeah,
I made a simple
understand
chord
that.
and strummed it. It rang soft and true.
Okay, so
I moved a finger, and the
It's
chord
really-
went
Yeah,
minor
from
in a
the
way that
get-go.
always
Cut head.
sounded to me as if the
Then
lute
you
were
cut my
saying
head.
sad.
Yeah,
I moved my hands again, and the
We're
lute made
sitting
two
down, it's not
chords
really-
whispering
Yeah.
against each other.
So,
Then, without
Yeah.
realizing what
We're
I
going
was
through
doing,
the drill.
I began to
cut
play.
head,
Uh-huh.
and then you
The
cut my
strings
head,
felt
I guard
strange
mine.
against my fingers, like reunited
no.
friends who have
This is a
forgotten
drill.
what they
It's-
have in common.
So
I'm
it goes
I
not
back
played
and
gonna
soft
try to cut your
and
head.
slow, sending
I'm gonna
notes
stab
no
you now.
farther
But
than the
this is-
circle of our
okay,
fire
alright.
might.
Yes,
This is
Fingers
exactly
and
what I was talking
strings
about
made a
yesterday
careful
when I was
conversation,
trying to show
as if their
somebody
dance
something,
described
and then
the
they wanna say,
lies
"Why
of
don't
an
you
infatuation.
You'll learn this real quick.
Then I felt something inside me
Yeah.
break, and music
Can
began
it
to
come?
pour out into the quiet. My fingers danced, intricate and quick.
Good
They
job.
spun something gossamer
This
and
is-
tremulous into the
this is
circle of
the
light our
drill
fire had made.
That just goes through.
The music moved
cuts
like a
and guards,
spider
it's
web,
not a spar,
stirred by a
it's a drill.
gentle breath. It changed
Okay,
like a
do you
leaf
remember
what I-
twisting
tactical
as
drill.
it falls to the ground,
Right.
and it felt like
Right,
3
so do you
years
remember when I
waterside in
said-
Tarbean,
I think that
with a
their
hollowness inside
star
you
is
and hands that
inverted.
ached from the bitter
Like they're
cold.
going here to here to here.
I
I'm
don't
just
know
not
how
arguing
long
with
I
what the
played.
masters
It could have been 10
Yeah.
minutes
I'm just doing
or an
what
But
hour,
I
they're
think
telling
it
me.
but my hands
the
weren't used to the
star
strain.
goes from
They slipped
here
and the music fell to pieces like a
here.
dream on waking.
back up.
I looked up
and
to
then
see
back
everyone
across,
perfectly
and then back
motionless,
down.
their faces ranging from
Because
shock
there's
amazement.
a large range
Then,
of motion.
as if my gaze had broken some spell. Everyone stirred.
But I can do
Rowant
it.
shifted in his seat.
It's just
The
that.
two
I just
mercenaries
didn't know
turned
where
and
to
raised
go
eyebrows
first.
at each
Okay,
other.
the first is St. George.
Derek
so
looked at me as
the
if
cut
he had
to the
never
head,
seen me before.
St. George.
Rita remained
Cut to my
frozen,
head,
her
I guard
hand
my
held
head.
in front of her mouth.
Oh, I'm
Denna
doing
lowered
a-
her face
a
into her
bow and arrow
hands
to
and
cut
began
your
to
head.
cry
And
in
then
quiet,
I cut to left
hopeless
side of cheek,
sobs.
you guard left side of cheek.
Uh-huh.
Jason simply
I guard-
stood.
and then I guard
His
left
face
side
was
of cheek.
stricken and bloodless, as if he'd been stabbed.
No,
You're
it's still
guarded.
gonna-
I held out the lute,
It's
not
not
knowing whether
combat,
to
it's
thank
drill.
him or apologize.
I cut,
He took
we're
it
just
numbly.
doing, we're just doing the same thing
After a
back and
moment,
forth.
unable to think of
Okay.
anything to say,
So I cut
I
there,
left them sitting by the fire
you
and
do a
walked
simple
toward the
one with these
wagons.
guys.
And that is how Kvothe spent his last night before he came to the university,
Oh,
with his
You have to
cloak
look-
as
I think
both
you have
his
to look at the
blanket
chart
and
to
his
see what I'm
bed.
talking about, too.
As he
So,
lay
from
down,
the-
behind
so
him
here it
was a
is.
circle of
It's
fire, and
cut
before
head,
him lay
guard
shadow
head.
like a mantle gathered. His
You're
eyes
back.
were open.
supposed to
Yeah.
attack
That much
you
is
now.
certain.
Now, and
But
then
who among us
I
can
cut
say
to
they
left
know
side of
what he
cheek,
was
you
seeing?
guard left side of cheek.
Uh-huh.
Look behind
And then
him
I
instead,
go to guard
to the
my
circle
left
of
side
light
cheek
that the
because
fire
you're-
has made,
you go
and
from
leave Kvothe to himself
guard
for now.
But
to-
Everyone deserves a moment or two
Each
alone
time
when they
it's like-
desire it. And if by chance there
on
were
the thing,
tears,
it's
let
like-
us forgive him.
It's like, okay,
He was just a child,
I
after
cut
all,
to head.
and had yet to
guard my
learn
head.
what sorrow really
I
was.
cut your right side. I guard my right side. I cut your
But
left side.
Chapter
because
35.
everything I'm doing
A
is
parting
swing.
of ways.
Yeah, it's, but and the slip.
The weather
Okay,
held
okay,
fair,
I got you, I got
which
you.
meant that the
Every time it
wagons
comes back.
rolled into
Everything-
Imre
So
just
I'm
as
not
the sun
range
was
for
setting.
attacks, yeah.
I'm
My
not-
mood was sullen and
I'm
hurt.
not double tapping.
Denna had shared a wagon with Jocelyn the whole of the day,
Cut right side
and
of
I,
body,
being foolish and
guard
proud,
right side,
had
right.
kept my distance.
Cut right
You
A
side.
whirl
cut
of
right
activity
side,
sprang up as soon
and
as
I
the wagons
swing
rolled
around
to a
here.
stop.
Cut right side.
Rowant began to
And I
argue with
swing
a
around
clean-shaven man in a velvet hat before he had
And I
brought his
swing
wagon
around
to a
here.
full stop. After the
And I
initial bout
swing
of
around
bargaining,
here.
a dozen men began unloading bolts of cloth,
Okay.
barrels of molasses, and burlap sacks of coffee.
No.
Rita cast a stern eye over the lot of them. Jocelyn
agree
scuttled
with
around,
the-
trying to keep
with
his
the
luggage from
trading.
being damaged or stolen.
Sorry.
My own luggage
But
was
that's-
easier to manage,
Look,
as I only had my travel sack. I
Say
retrieved it from between some bolts of cloth and moved away from the wagons. I slung it over one shoulder and looked around for Denna. I found Rita instead. "You were a great help on the road," she said clearly. Her Aturan was much better than Rowan's, with hardly any trace of Siaro accent
But
at all.
I'm gonna try this with the whole.
It is
double,
nice to
double.
have someone along who can unhitch a horse
Because-
without being
all right,
led by the
So
hand.
in fencing,
She
here
held
I
out a
am.
coin to me.
Ta-da!
I took it without thinking.
I go.
It was a
ping,
reflex
ping,
action from my years
attack.
as a beggar. like the reverse of jerking
Because
your hand back from a
the
fire.
word gride,
Only after the coin was in my hand did I
Gride,
take a closer look at it.
is your blade
It was a whole copper jar,
slipping
fully
in
half
between
of what I had
ribs.
paid to travel with them to Imre.
So,
When I looked back up,
this is my
Rita was
blade.
heading back toward the wagons.
Ping, ping,
Not sure what to think,
attack.
I wandered over to where Derek
And
sat
then,
on the edge of a horse trough.
When I
He
pull
shaded
this
his eyes
out,
against the evening sun with one hand
I'm
as he looked
pulling
up at
out
me.
this way.
On your way, then?
And that
I almost thought you
is
might stick
the
with us for a while.
sound of the word
I shook
drive.
my head.
I understand. Ping, ping.
Rita just gave me a jot. He nodded. I'm not terribly surprised.
Oh, that's
Most
great.
folks are nothing but dead weight.
Wow.
He
Come on
shrugged.
in.
Huh?
And she appreciated your
Well,
playing.
yeah, no, but
Yeah.
I mean, like, that's
Have you ever
that's
thought
really
of trying
great.
out as a
I
minstrel?
didn't know this
They say
before,
Imre's a good
'cause
place
our
for it.
sabers are straight.
I steered the conversation back to Rita. I don't want Rowan to be angry with her.
Go.
He seems to take his money pretty seriously.
Yeah,
Derek
I
laughed.
understand.
we're
And she
assuming.
doesn't?
I'm just looking at things.
I gave my money to Rowan, I clarified. If he wanted to give some of it back, I think he'd do it himself. Derek nodded. It's not their way. A man doesn't give money away. That's my point, I said. I don't want her to get in trouble.
You're gonna attack.
Derek waved his hands back
I
and
know,
forth,
but
cutting
I
me
mean,
off.
like, you can totally attack.
I'm not doing
It's
a good
alright.
job of explaining myself, he said. Rowan knows. He might have even sent her over to do it. But grown Sealdish men don't give away
See what I was
money.
trying to do.
It's seen as womanish
That's
behavior.
I was trying to, like, put
They
it
don't
back
even
up there.
buy things if they
That's
can help it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Didn't you notice that Rita was the one
I'm
who
not
bargained
lunging
for
in
our
that,
rooms and food at the inn a few nights ago? I did
Too
remember,
much
now that
forward.
he mentioned it.
Yeah.
But
Yep,
why?
Yep.
I asked.
When
Derek
you,
shrugged.
When you commit your
There
torso,
isn't any why.
you commit
It's
your
just the way
sword.
they do things. That's why so many Sealdish caravans are husband-wife teams. Derek! Rowan's voice came from behind the wagons. He sighed as he stood up. Duty calls, he said. See you
I'm
around.
gonna switch hands.
I tucked the jot
I
into
didn't
my
even know I
pocket
could
and
do
thought
that.
about what
I'm
Derek
like,
had said.
ha
The truth was, my troop
There it
had
is.
never gone so far north as to make it into the Shald.
Sorry.
It was unnerving to think I wasn't as world-wise as I'd thought. I slung my travel sack over my shoulder and looked around one last time, thinking that perhaps it would be best if I left without any troublesome goodbyes.
That's good.
Denna was nowhere to be
You're fine,
seen.
dog.
That settled it then. I turned to leave
Scarf, come up.
and found her standing behind me.
Come up now.
She smiled a little awkwardly with her hands clasped behind her back. She was lovely
actually,
as a
I'm not
flower
gonna even
and
attack
totally unconscious of it. I was suddenly short of breath, and I forgot myself, my irritation, my hurt. You're still going? She asked. I nodded. You could come to Annalyn with us, she suggested. They say the streets are paved with gold there. You could teach Jazen to play that lute he carries around. She smiled. I've asked him. He said he wouldn't mind. I considered it. For half a heartbeat, I
Not falling
almost
for
threw
it.
my whole plan
I
aside
will,
just
in
to
just a
stay with
second.
her a little longer.
Oh, no,
But the moment passed,
I'm
and I shook my head.
I'm letting you know.
Don't look like that. She chided me with a
And
smile.
then I'm gonna come in. I'm gonna
I'll be
tap
there
your
for a
shoulder.
while. If things don't work out for you here... She trailed off hopefully. I didn't know what I could do if things didn't work out for
Your
me
light
here.
is on.
I was hanging all my hopes on the university.
It's okay.
You're
Besides,
you're like,
Annalyn
Oh,
was
I'm
hundreds
sorry.
of miles
Oh,
away.
No, it was just
I
total.
barely owned
It
the
was a
clothes on
total
my back.
deal.
How would I find
in
her?
the gymnasium? It was a
Denna must
total
have
deal.
seen my thoughts
like, we would
reflected on my
position
face.
ourselves
She
so
smiled
that
playfully.
the other person.
Right.
I guess
Yeah.
I'll just have to come looking
Absolutely,
for you
dude.
then. We rue our travelers. Our lives are composed of meetings and partings, with brief, bright acquaintances in between. Because of this, I knew the truth. I felt it, heavy and certain in the pit of my stomach. I would never see her again.
I'll stand up.
Before I could say anything, she looked nervously behind
Do
her.
these things.
I had better go.
Scarf.
Watch for
Get
me.
up.
She flashed her impish smile again before
Just
turning
put
to
him
walk away.
downstairs.
I will, I called after her. I'll see you where the roads meet. She glanced back and hesitated for a moment, then waved and ran off into the early evening twilight.
Oh, yeah, I
Just
don't.
go slow to the thing.
Go.
Chapter 36. Less Talents. I spent the night sleeping outside the city limits of Imre in a soft bed of heather. The next day I woke late, washed in a nearby stream, and made my way west to the university. As I walked, I watched the horizon for the largest building in the university. From Ben's descriptions, I knew what it would look like. Featureless, gray, and square as a block, larger than 4 granaries stacked together. No windows, no decorations, and only one set of great stone doors. 10 times 10,000 books. The archives. I had come to the university for many reasons, but that was at the heart of it. The archives held answers, and I had many, many questions. First and foremost, I wanted to know the truth about the Chandrian and the Emir. I needed to know how much of Scarpi's story was the truth. When the road crossed the Omethi River, there was an old stone bridge. I don't doubt that you know the type. It was one of those ancient, mammoth pieces of architecture scattered throughout the world, so old and solidly built that they have become part of the landscape, not a soul wondering who built them or why. This one was particularly impressive, over 200 feet long and wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other. It stretched over the canyon the Omethi had carved into the rock. When I reached the crest of the bridge, I saw the archives for the first time in my life, rising like some great gray stone over the trees to the west. The university lay at the heart of a small city, though truthfully, I hesitate to call it a city at all. It was nothing like Tarbian, with its twisting alleys and garbage smell. It was more of a town, with wide roads and clean air. Lawns and gardens were spaced between small houses and shops. But since this town had grown up to serve the peculiar needs of the university, a careful observer could note small differences in the services the town provided. For instance, there were 2 glass blowers, 3 fully stocked apothecaries, 2 binderies, 4 booksellers, 2 brothels, and a truly disproportionate number of taverns. One of them had a large wooden sign nailed to its door proclaiming, "No sympathy." I wondered what non-arcane visitors might think of the warning. The university itself consisted of about 15 buildings that bore little resemblance to each other. Muse had a circular central hub with 8 wings radiating in each direction, so it looked like a compass rose. Hollows was simple and square, with stained glass windows showing Tecum in a classic pose, standing barefoot in the mouth of his cave, speaking to a group of students. Main's was the most distinctive building of the lot. It covered nearly 1.5 acres and looked like it had been cobbled together from a number of smaller, mismatched buildings. As I approached the archives, its gray, windowless surface reminded me of an immense greystone. It was hard to believe, after all the years of waiting, that I was finally there. I circled around it until I found the entrance, a massive pair of stone doors standing wide open. Over them, chiseled deep into the stone, were the words Vorfelen Renata More. I didn't recognize the language. It wasn't Siaru, maybe Yiddish or Temic. Yet another question I needed answers for. Through the stone doors were a small antechamber with a more ordinary set of wooden doors inside. I tugged them open and felt cool, dry air brush past me. The walls were bare gray stone, lit with a distinctive, unwavering reddish light of sympathy lamps. There was a large wooden desk with several large ledger-type books lying open atop it. At the desk sat a young man who looked to be a full-blooded Siel, with the characteristic ruddy complexion and dark hair and eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice thick with the harsh burr a Siaro accent makes. "I'm here for the archives," I said stupidly. My stomach was dancing with butterflies. My palms were sweaty. He looked me over, obviously wondering at my age. "Are you a student?" "Soon," I said. I haven't been through admissions yet."
"You'll need to do that first," he said seriously. "I can't let anyone in unless they're in the book."
He gestured at the ledgers on the desk in front of him. The butterflies died. I didn't bother to hide my disappointment. "Are you sure I can't look around just for a couple of minutes? I've come an awfully long way." I looked at the 2 sets of double doors leading out of the room. One labeled Tomes, the other Stacks. Behind the desk, a smaller door was labeled Scribs Only. His expression softened somewhat.
"I cannot. There would be trouble."
He looked me over again.
"Are you really going through admissions?"
His skepticism was obvious, even through his thick accent. I nodded. "I just came here first," I said, looking around the empty room, eyeing the closed doors, trying to think of some way to persuade him to let me in. He spoke before I could think of anything.
"If you're really going, you should hurry. Today is the last day. Sometimes they don't go much longer than noon."
My heart beat hard and quick in my chest. I'd assumed they would run all day. "Where are they?"
"Hollows."
He gestured toward the outer door.
"Down, then left.